Let's do a code walkthrough. Code walkthroughs, I think, are useful because there's a gap between how something works conceptually and how it works in real life. So this is when we go without a net, and I hope that the demo that I put together actually works just as well when I do it in lecture as it did when I was doing it at home. Actually, not when I was doing it at home, when I was doing it in my office. I didn't do it at home because frickin' Comcast is not working again. And I don't care if the rest of the world hears that. OK. OK. So what did I do? OK. So let's start by doing a code walkthrough. First of all, what's the experience that we're going after here? My goal is to get it so that I can log in to Rotten Potatoes using my Twitter information, using my Twitter account, and thereby have Rotten Potatoes have access to at least some of my Twitter information, even something basic like my screen name. So here's the user experience, which I really hope works. Oh, and let me make sure that let's get rid of the debugger thing. That was for illustrative purposes only. So you can see that I've added a new link up here in the corner. It says log in with your Twitter account. When I click on it, I get taken over to, I'm actually on Twitter's site. I'm securely connected to Twitter's site. I now get to log in as me, if I can remember what my Twitter password is, because I never use it. And let's do the happy path first. I'm going to authorize the app. I'm back. And hello. Hold on a second. OK, sorry about that. I guess I had to reload the page. So now it knows who I am. And you could probably, I guess it's not hard for you to believe that the only place I could have gotten this information is from Twitter, because I haven't actually logged into Rotten Potatoes directly. Right? There's no login flow that's part of my app. The only login flow I did was on Twitter. So this is actually coming from Twitter directly. And if I log out, it reverts to log in with your Twitter account. And hopefully, redirecting. There, OK. I don't know why the redirect didn't work the first time. So that's kind of the most basic example. So let's kind of take a look at the moving parts of the code and see how everything worked. The first thing is, if we go back to kind of the initial phase, what happens, where is the application going when I click this link? Well, I don't know if you can kind of see down here in the address bar, but when I hover over it, it's going to /auth/Twitter. So what is that? Is that like a route in my application? Actually, that is a route provided by the OmniAuth gem. Here's my routes file. So OmniAuth is a really nice library that abstracts away essentially the entire process. Right? It provides the necessary routes, the callbacks, and all of the OAuth logic to work with different providers. The only things that I have to provide in terms of my application is, first of all, I have to tell OmniAuth which strategy I want to use. So what is the third-party site that I want to try to connect to? In our case, it's Twitter. And there's another config file whose name I forget. There it is, auth.yaml. There we go. I won't. I guess I'll be changing my consumer key and consumer secret now that they're on the screen and therefore on the internet. But when you create an application and you want to have your application potentially be able to interoperate with a third-party auth provider like Twitter, you actually also have to be a Twitter user and set up an API key as a Twitter developer. That API key is what's going to allow your developer app to connect with Twitter. So different sites have different ways of how they generate the key. But basically, we're telling OAuth, here's the information you're going to need to even attempt to establish a dialogue with Twitter about doing this. OK? So what else do we have to put in our routes file? Well, whenever we go to /auth/some provider, the OmniAuth gem will actually take care of redirecting that to the remote site. The interaction with the remote site, once it's handled, the way the remote site works is once you've authenticated successfully, it will try to do a callback to a URL inside your application. Right? So this is kind of a generic version of this flow, is once I've finished authenticating myself on twitter.com, it's actually going to try to do a redirect back to another page on my site. And that redirect is going to include as its data that secret token that I'm going to use whenever I want to actually request access to my Twitter features. So that means that we have to provide an endpoint for that callback to come back. Right? And that is what this route is specifying. Basically, using provider as a wildcard, because Twitter is a provider, we could use Google. There's like 20 different provider strategies that this gem supports. But basically, we'll need to provide a route that looks like this and that does whatever our app is going to do on successful authentication. So remember I mentioned that the abstraction here is we're going to model the session as its own thing. We're going to have a controller that creates a new session when you successfully log in and destroys that session when you either log out or the session times out. So we're going to go to the sessions controller in a minute, and we're going to show what this function does. What happens if authentication fails? Well, we're supposed to provide a route that will map /auth/failure, and we have to provide a controller method that does something in the event that the user failed to authenticate properly to Twitter, or in the event that the user decided to decline and they clicked the cancel button on Twitter and said, actually, no, you don't have access to do this. The reason that these are called /auth/whatever is because OmniAuth is remapping the callback that comes from Twitter. So if you look at Twitter's API developer documentation, they will have a URL that they expect you to pass, and they say, this is the URL that we're going to call back. When OmniAuth is handling this for you, it passes a URL that looks like this. So basically, what OmniAuth is saying is, when authentication is complete, this is the URL that you should use for a callback, and I will expect you, Twitter, to pass back any parameters that contain that secret token that's going to be the basis of future access. In fact, I will, since we're here anyway, I'm going to trigger the SAD path. And what you'll see is that I did not write a handler for the SAD path. OK, I did not sign in. That's that's Twitter letting me know that you've declined to do this. And if I try to return, again, if you can see the bottom of the screen, it's kind of hard to read, isn't it? Because it's in like FlySpec 3. If you could read it by getting really close up to the screen, so internet people come close to the screen. But what you can see in the bottom bar is that if I click on this button, it's going to take me to localhost 3000, that's where my app is running on my machine, /auth/Twitter/callback with a bunch of data after it. Right? And remember I said that the regular authentication flow is, before we start talking to Twitter, we tell it, in the event of when authentication completes, here's the URL that you should call back so that Rotten Potatoes, can handle either a successful or an unsuccessful authentication. So that's what that is. I will now click on the button to take me there, and boom, I get an unauthorized error. Not very graceful, but this is only because I didn't do anything special in the failure handler. We're going to show that in a moment. But for this example, what I would do in a normal production app is I would provide in my controller method, I would look at the response and say, oh, something bad happened. I would display a friendly message, and life would go on as it always has. All right, so let's look at the sessions controller that actually, oops. So what are probably the most interesting method is the create method, because this is the one where you have to handle the case that the user decided to actually authenticate and go ahead. So how are we handling it in this case? Remember these dynamic finders where you can find by whatever you want? I wrote this code under the assumption that I might change my mind about which authentication provider to use, or that I might give the user a choice of, you could sign in with your Twitter or your GitHub or your whatever account. So actually, I want to be able to keep track of both the provider name and the user ID that provider thinks the user is. Right? So I have some unique user ID on each one of these services. It's probably different on every service, but we need a way to map the service's ID of who I am to Rotten Potatoes' ID of who I am. So basically, I did this by adding a provider and UID column to the users table, to the moviegoers table, I should say. And when I get the post back from Twitter, my create method gets called. If you look at the OmniAuth documentation, it will show you that you can get this hash, which is basically all the parameters that got sent back by the auth provider. So Twitter's API says, here's the fields that come back on successful authentication. All of those fields become available in this omniauth.auth hash. And I am using the provider and UID fields, which, again, how do you know this? You read the Twitter documentation. I'm going to use the provider and UID fields. UID is what came from Twitter. Provider is what I told OmniAuth I was using. So if I already have a user, in other words, if I recognize who this is, right? Somebody has previously logged in and established that with respect to this provider, they have this unique ID, well, then I'm done. Because that's the person who just authenticated, right? Twitter just told me this UID, and if I've already seen this UID in the past and associated it with somebody, then all I got to do is make this person be the active logged in user. If not, what it might mean is that this user has never logged in before. I have no record of this person existing. So I will create them. And in a minute, we're going to look at this create with OmniAuth method. But let's leave that aside for the moment. The only thing I really end up doing is I record the ID of the active user in the session. The session is tamper evident. So in the future, basically, I can declare a before filter, just like I showed earlier, that checks session user ID. If it's non-nil and it corresponds to the ID of an existing person, that person is logged in. Otherwise, nobody is logged in. And then I do a redirect, and the person is in the app. So that's how you set up a session. What if failure happens? Well, as you saw, I didn't do anything in my failure method. I just raised an exception, and I wanted to show what the parameters of the failure were. But in real life, you would put up a nice message saying, please try again, or whatever. And session destroy is what would get called if somebody actually logged out of Rotten Potatoes, and then all I do is delete the user ID from the session, so it shows that nobody is logged in. So what about this create with OmniAuth? What's going on there? Let's go look at the model. So what does create with OmniAuth do? Well, the premise here is I've never seen this user, right? Because if I had seen them before, I would have recorded their Twitter-provided UID as part of I would record their Twitter-provided UID as the UID attribute of that person in the moviegoers table. So if I've never seen them before, what do I do? Well, I create them, right? And what fields do I fill in? The provider that authenticated them to me, the provider's ID, the provider's idea of what the unique ID of that person is. And in this case, I can also populate the name field, because the Twitter developer API tells you that in the list of parameters you get back, you'll get an info hash that has a name property. It also has a few other properties. And then depending on what privileges you asked for from Twitter, you can do additional calls to get things like who you're following and stuff like that. But in this case, all I did was use some of the information that comes back just as part of the authentication response. So in this simple example, I now have the token, and I could do additional calls to Twitter to find out other stuff. In fact, there's various gems that allow your Rails apps to talk to Twitter, but you're sort of keys to the kingdom where you have to get authenticated first. So that's what this example focused on. So kind of to sum up, what did we do here? We used a gem that abstracts and provides a uniform API to any third-party auth provider. We had to set up routes that will handle callbacks from the auth provider, both in the case of success, in which case we want to create a session and establish that this person is the logged in user. In the case of failure, I didn't do anything fancy, but you would want a method that puts up some sort of a friendly message, and to handle logging out. So if the user logs out of Rotten Potatoes, then you want to forget that they're logged in. That's sort of independent of how they authenticated themselves to begin with. This is all predicated on the fact that I've already registered as a developer my app with Twitter, because in order to even engage in this conversation, I need to have these tokens that are assigned on a per app, per developer basis. So if your project team wants to do this, you would go to Twitter or however many authentication providers you want to interoperate with, and you would generate a key. And by the way, the reason it's called consumer key and consumer secret is that's OAuth terminology. OAuth is the standard that's used by most of these sites to do this protocol. And in OAuth, consumer secret and consumer key is what they're called. So that's what the OAuth gem calls them too. So you'll get your consumer secret and consumer key for as many different sites as you want. You'll provide that info in auth.yaml. You'll provide a list of preferred authentication providers, and you can just have links in your app to say authenticate with. And pretty much OmniAuth will take care of routing to the correct page, dealing with the callbacks, and all you're doing is providing these 3 endpoints. It's very nicely abstracted. Another reason to use OmniAuth, by the way, is even if you want to have your own login where you collect a password, you remember the user's password, there's a lot of ways to do that badly and insecurely. OmniAuth has a strategy for local authentication that's actually decent. And it has a strategy for local authentication that doesn't require any password, and you can use it for testing. So a standard problem you have when you're doing password-based anything is to demonstrate things to people, you have to create a bunch of fake logins for them. And with the OmniAuth testing strategy, you don't have to do that. And OmniAuth also comes with test hooks to make it easy to write cucumber scenarios like how I log in, and if I'm a logged in user, or given that I've been logged in successfully. It provides essentially macros and stubs so that you can do a lot of that stuff without having your app actually call out to the providers that you're trying to authenticate with. So in case you haven't gotten the message here, is use OmniAuth. Don't do your own login information, because nobody wants to remember yet another password. Let's just face the facts. Everybody's on Facebook anyway. Just use that.